Good evening, everyone. My name is Asad Lalji. On behalf of Avid Learning, I welcome you all to this captivating discussion, uncovering urban legacies, tracing the Armenian heritage across Calcutta and Bombay. It draws inspiration from Avid's Multipolis Mumbai series, which began in 2012, that aimed to decode the past while looking to the future and finding novel ways to engage with, interact with, and re-energize the city we love. During the series, we had presented close to 50 in-person discussions on this maximum city. Coincidentally, the series was started with our moderator for this evening, 10 years back, Naresh Fernandes. In our online avatar, in February of last year, we launched a new series, Uncovering Urban Legacies, that looked at the Jewish diasporas in Bombay, followed by the Iranian diaspora, the Portuguese diaspora, and then the Chinese. Today, we have something really special for you. In the 5th edition of the ongoing series, we celebrate the legacy of the Armenian diaspora, not just in Bombay, but from Calcutta as well. We strongly believe in the power of collaboration and proud to present this evening with our partners, Editions JOJO, Mumbai's only public photo book library. A special thank you, and obviously the Gateway House, our partners for this series. A special thanks to the Mumbai Research Centre, the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, for hosting us. And this is like a flashback for us, because Avid used to be here for many years at the Calcutta Arts Festival, managing all the workshops in this wonderful, beautiful room. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our panel of experts, photographer, archivist and writer Alakananda Nag, author, Bombay History Fellow at the Gateway House Sifra Lentin. She is Avid's go-to historian, constant companion on our Uncovering Urban Legacy series. Our moderator for this evening is journalist and editor of Scroll.in, Naresh Fernandes, who also has been a mentor to Avid for over 10 years. So it feels very nice to have this group of people together. A special mention to editor International Gallery, Abina Sarkar Elias, who's out with her magazine's 49th edition that coincidentally is an issue in Armenia. It features pieces celebrating the Armenian heritage of Kolkata. So make sure you check out the copies at the back, and if you want to buy one, they're up for sale. For more about our very esteemed speakers, their bios should have been emailed to you. In case not, I think they may have been handed out also to you all earlier. Through this lecture demonstration, our experts, Alakananda and Sifra, will discuss the heritage of the Armenian diaspora in Calcutta and Bombay, respectively. Sifra will explore the global history of the Armenian diaspora and their trade and mercantile journey, cultural contributions in food and music, and much more with specific to Bombay. Alakananda will share her inspirations that got her to document the stories of the communities in her native city and anecdotes on their lives that she captured. The presentations will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Naresh. So now, please take out your phones, put them on silent, though I don't think you're going to get any reception here. Start using them, tagging, retagging, posting. Our handle is @Avid Learning. Our hashtag is Learning Never Stops. Thank you very much for braving this wonderful monsoon again in October and being with us this evening. Over to you, Naresh. Look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. What a wonderful, bright and sunny day we've chosen to be here. And so I thought we should begin with a piece of music. Okay, so that was a tune called Dhun Kalyan Kawali. And if it sounds a little scratchy, it's because it was made just over a century ago. The disc was lost until my friend Suresh Chandwankar found it in Chor Bazaar and made this recording. It's about the best version we could get. It's a nazam of 8 stanzas in which the singer talks about how significant Bombay is to her. She praises the people of Bombay and thanks her patrons. We could hear her say, Gokuldas, Seth, Ratan Singh were among them. And in the end, she dedicated this song to Firosha Mehta. Ye kamal ka gana hai Firosha Mehta ki taarif mein, she says. This tune is especially resonant for us this evening because it was recorded in this very building, the town hall as it was known, in the first half of July 1907. And the people mentioned in the tune were in the audience at that time, perhaps sitting exactly where you were. At the end of the tune, you could hear, if you listen very carefully, the singer announce, "My name is Gohar Jan," she says. Not an act of ego, but because the engineer in the factory would then know whose voice it was on that wax disc. Gohar Jan, though, as many of you know, had much to be proud about. On November the 11th, 1902, she stepped into a makeshift studio in a hotel in Calcutta, where an American engineer named Fred Gasberg was making the subcontinent's first recordings on a newfangled talking machine that had been invented not so long before then by this chap called Thomas Alva Edison. In his diaries, Gasberg noted the scene as Gohar Jan swept into the room, regally dressed, accompanied by 4 musicians and a train of attendants, one bearing her hookah, one to prepare her pan, another just to fan her. At her session the next day, Gasberg wrote, she came even more elaborately dressed and wore a whole mine of jewels. That wasn't surprising. Gohar Jan was among the most popular singers and dancers of her time, and her fame was matched by her affluence. She earned 300 rupees a performance, Gasberg wrote, and could often be seen on the Maidan in the evening in a fine carriage and a pair of horses. His memoirs also note, she's very eccentric, and I heard a story today of how some years ago her cat had a litter of kittens. To celebrate the occasion, Gohar Jan gave a fest at her home, costing her 20,000 rupees. It's worth recalling that when Gasberg made those early recordings, other master musicians of the time, many of them men, were wary of this new technology. Some of them weren't sure how to fit elaborate ragas onto the 3-minute format that these new recording devices required. Others were afraid that by recording their music, they'd been giving away their secrets that their rivals could copy. Gohar Jan was among the first Indians to see the potential of this new technology, and she grabbed the opportunity when it presented itself. And she lived life on her own terms. Over the next 2 decades, Gohar Jan would make hundreds of recordings. It's unclear exactly how many she made. Some say 600. There are about 200 recordings that have since been found, often fished out of dusty bins in Chor Bazaar by people like my friend Suresh. She made them in 20 languages and a variety of styles. She even made a recording in English, though that one sadly has been lost. Gohar Jan was India's first recording star, selling large numbers of discs, her likeness appearing on postcards and matchbox labels. And yes, there's another detail Gasberg mentions that's pertinent to this event today. Not only did Gohar Jan record Dhun Kalyan Kawali in this very building, she was of Armenian heritage. She was born in Azamgarh in the United Provinces in 1873 to an Armenian father, Robert William Yearwood, and her real name was Eileen Angelina Yearwood. We're going to meet Gohar Jan a little later this evening, I think, in Alakananda's presentation. But to begin with, I'd like to ask Sifra to tell us about her research into the life of the Armenians in Bombay.
Thanks everyone for coming here today, and I'd like to thank Asad and Naresh. And my presentation is going to be a little serious because I wanted to really contextualize the Armenian diaspora in India, and more specifically in Bombay. Now, my interest in the Armenians, I was aware of the Armenians ever since I was a child. And it actually began because when my parents got married, they lived in a small guest house in the early years of their marriage in 1957 called Buckley Court at Kolkata. Now, Buckley Court was run by an Armenian lady, and I did not know her name, and I don't think my mother ever really told me what her name was about, and never mentioned it. But the one thing that really stuck with me was on the 6th of January every year, guests were not allowed to come down. Dinner was served in your room because this lady entertained all her community and friends for Christmas on the 6th of January. And that really got me thinking. We, of course, later, when I was born, I lived at Nepinsi Road and I grew up there. But every time we came to Kolkata to shop, my mom would point out Buckley Court. So that's a little bit, and I learned through my recent research that the lady's name was Mrs. Rose Basil. And this name was given to me by Mrs. Joshi, who was the last Armenian caretaker of the church here in Mumbai. I had the opportunity to really learn about the Armenians when Mrs. Nuat Mehta was alive, but somehow did not get down to it. And she passed away in 2012. Now, I was also always under the impression, in fact, Rafiq also, Baghdadi, who's amongst us today, also mentioned that Mrs. Mehta would have Christmas feasts or Christmas parties on the 6th of January for all her Bombay history people. So that was another little bit, and she passed away in 2012. And I always thought of her as being an American Armenian, but she grew up in Turkey. So the diaspora is very strong on either side of the Caucasian Isthmus, as I call it, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, either in West Asia or in the East. So let's get to know a little about who the Armenians are and how did they come here to our city. Now, Mumbai doesn't really have an Armenian community today, at least not from the old community that we know of. We have young expats who formed WhatsApp groups. I managed to sort of enter one group, and they're young ladies, exceptionally beautiful, who have banded together and are trying to discover the Armenian heritage of our city. But it's a very private group, so I'm not going to take any names here. But Mrs. Joshi, Zabel Joshi, is actually the last of the old community. And actually, I wouldn't even call her the last of the old community because she came here to Mumbai in the 1970s. But she sort of knew of the old community, the senior citizens who remained behind. Now, Mumbai always had a very small community of Armenians. It was never as big as Calcutta in the 19th and 20th century, never as big as Madras for that matter. But it is a community with a history that sort of feeds into the Armenian diaspora history. So what we have here and what we have visually left in our city is actually just the Armenian church and the Armenian cemetery at Antop Hill. Now, there used to be an Armenian lane. I don't know if the name still remains, but it is there on the maps of Bombay of the 1930s. It's a long lane that connects Meadow Street or Nagindas Master Road to Bruce Street or Homi Modi Street. Now, I have covered most of the important foreign immigrant communities, trading communities in my book, Mercantile Bombay. But I was a little too late to put in the Armenian community. So hopefully if the book goes in for a second edition, it will be there. Now, Armenian merchants were well known in the Indian Ocean trade of the 17th and the 18th centuries. Before this period, they were a well-established overland trading community. and would traverse the routes that we know as the Eurasian caravan routes, known as the Silk Roads. Now, what has to be understood here is that Bombay's Armenians, how they came to settle down in English East India Company, Bombay, in the 17th century, and why their numbers actually dwindled. Calcutta's grew, but Bombay's numbers were dwindled by the late 18th century almost, and early 19th century. Now, what you see here on the screen is Saint Gregory the Illuminator. Now, he is very, very central to Armenian history because Armenia was the first Christian kingdom, or first kingdom to adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301 CE. Now, Saint Gregory is considered the first patriarch of the Armenian Orthodox Church. Now, the two Armenian ladies that I actually interviewed were very, very specific because if you look at a map of Armenia, you will see that it is actually surrounded by Muslim countries. Whether in the past, I mean, in the early history it was Byzantium, but later it was Turkey, Persia, the Persian Gulf countries, Central Asia. So this little country in the middle was actually a sort of a buffer zone. Now, this is important because it helps us understand that Armenia, there are 2 or 3 things that it was in a really strategic place, Armenia. So as a result of which, it was always sort of caught, like Afghanistan is, between powerful empires. And that actually triggered the immigration of the Armenian population across West Asia, Central Asia, coming down to India, even as far as Tibet, Russia, and Europe. Now, what kept the Armenian identity through the diaspora intact? Now, it's important to understand that much like the Jewish community, the world over, the Jewish diaspora, the Armenians too maintained their identity through the spiritual authority of their church in Armenia. It's called Ichmat. I can't pronounce the name, but it's on the screen for you to watch. Echmiatsin, as Alakananda tells me. And they, from the 5th century onwards, not only was the church there, but you had an Armenian alphabet that was actually sort of put together. So they had their own script, they had their own literature, they had their own music, and wherever the Armenian diaspora actually settled, they had their own school, which laid the foundation for their youngsters to really build an Armenian identity wherever they were and to avoid assimilation in some sense. They were largely successful because even today, the Armenian overseas community is around 8 to 10 million, while in Armenia itself, you just have a population of a little under 3 million Armenians. So you have to understand that any part of the world you go today, you will see Armenians. But now coming back to the history of the Armenians in India, is as far as Bombay is concerned, the Armenian community actually came from Surat. Surat was an important Mughal port city, and before Surat was actually even sort of taken over by the Mughals, they were already active traders in the Mughal Empire. Now, every Armenian history book that you read, written by the community itself, will talk about basically the great emperor. Akbar was more their patron and their mentor. So the great emperor, they were traders here for centuries on the Indian subcontinent, but it was a circulatory migration. They never settled. But under Akbar, they started forming residential settlements, whether it was in Agra, whether it was in Surat, across the northern Indian plains. Madras became important for them after the English East India Company took it over. So One was basically the fact that the community overseas has always been larger than the community in the country. Secondly, identity was important to them. The church was central to their political identity. And lastly is that the merchants, the prominent merchants, and Alakananda will tell us also, in Calcutta, established their churches, their schools, their community institutions, and old age home, I believe, in Calcutta. So this is how the community sort of kept their identity alive. Now, this is the Armenian network. The Armenian network was at its best or largest during the 17th to the 18th century. Okay, so this is roughly Armenia, and the big pink dot here is Madras. So during this time, Madras was an important Armenian center. Surat and Bombay are shown as smaller dots. And Calcutta had not yet grown into a big center at this point in time. Now, what is important for our history here in Mumbai or Madras or Calcutta is to remember that the Armenian community were largely of Iranian descent. Now, how did that really happen? It happened because Shah Abbas I, during his scorched earth policy in Armenia, Turkey and Armenia and Persia were always, the Ottoman Empire and Persia were always at loggerheads with each other, and Armenia was a sort of a buffer zone for both of them. What happened was that while during one of their wars in 1603, 1604, Shah Abbas decided to follow what was called a scorched earth policy. This is mentioned across all the history books and all the books written on Armenia. And he actually relocated the entire population of Armenia into Iran. But what was particularly significant for us here in India and to Armenian history in India is the fact that Armenia had a merchant town called Julfa. And he was particularly careful about relocating the merchants of Julfa. He took them across, he was careful while taking them across the border, and he relocated them in his capital city of Isfahan, forming a township called New Julfa. Now, the trade network, this is not a diaspora map, as it were. This is the Armenian trade network. I know India is sort of shown, the Indian subcontinent is shown this way, but this is, we can see that the network extended all the way to Russia. It was across, of course, Armenia, Turkey, Europe, and even went up to Tibet and to China. Now, it was the merchants of New Julfa who came here to Surat and settled in Surat. Now, very briefly, how did the East India Company or the English East India Company entice these very wealthy merchants to relocate to Bombay, especially when Bombay was nothing during that period? So, I was a little taken aback when I read this, but as early as 1688, the foremost Armenian merchant in Surat by the name of Khoja Fanus Kalandar signed a treaty on behalf of the Armenian nation, and it wasn't really, Armenia wasn't an independent state at that time, but Armenian nation, with the English East India Company in London. So he was a powerful merchant and he negotiated really hard. So the English East India Company said that if the Armenian merchants were to relocate here to Bombay, they could travel and they could transport their goods to and from Europe on company ships. They granted them, of course, religious freedom, which all trading communities were granted in Bombay, but they were given the privilege and allowed to own, given all the privileges that the English factors and private English merchants were given in the city. Now, this is another thing that you will find in the records is all the Armenian records talk, especially community papers, talk about not how great this treaty was, but really about how the English, through their guile, undermined the trading network of the Armenians. It seemed a great deal, big deal at that time, but actually they took over the trade which the Armenians were doing. It was a very successful trade. But looking a little further beyond that, I personally feel that it wasn't really just the English monopoly that crept in on the Armenians, but I felt it was more the collapse of New Julfa in Iran that led to the collapse of the Armenian trading network. Now, how many Armenians did Bombay really have? Okay, so Bombay actually had a very, very small community, and in the late 17th or 18th century was the peak time for this community. According to one account, in 1813, there were just 105 Armenians living in Bombay, and by January 1889, there were just 30 left. And this is repeatedly sort of said through the gazetteers and in the population census that I saw. Now, it appears that most of the Armenian merchants, at least, not the others, but the merchants at least, decided to relocate to other centers, particularly Calcutta. Now, Calcutta, there was a famous merchant in Calcutta called Aratun Apkar, who founded the famous firm of Apkar and Company, and he relocated from Bombay to Calcutta in 1830. Now, he owned collieries, he owned ships, he had a big trading business with China in opium. Now, in the early years of their migration, it appears that the Armenians actually lived within the fort walls. I spoke about Armenian Street. I could not find a map. I would have loved to show it. And the map that I had that showed Armenian Street, I could not locate the provenance of that map. So I did not want to show it without really knowing which year and who the map was drawn by. But it's clearly there. And they lived within the fort walls. So naturally, their church was built on Meadow Street within the fort walls. Now, what you see here in this picture, in these two photographs that I've taken, is a much smaller church. I don't know what the original church was, but what is very clear from the archives is that it was a larger compound. It had it had quarters for the priests, it had a guest house, it had a little school for Armenian children. But what remains now is this redeveloped church, which was rebuilt or built in 1957. Now, I could understand the reason. When I spoke to Mrs. Joshi, she said the community had completely depleted. We had to have funds to support the church. And one way of doing it was redeveloping the land that we had. And they've built a commercial building in the front. So the church is actually hidden behind Ararat building. Now, if you know a little bit about Armenia's history, I mean, biblical history, according to biblical history, the Armenians believe that their land is actually where the Garden of Eden is located. The two big biblical rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, have their sources in Armenia. And Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark finally rested, is actually in Armenia. So they pride themselves on this, and this is very much a part of their identity. Now, today the church is used for services by the Malankara Syrian Orthodox Church, and the Armenians consider this a sister church because it's the Orthodox Christian church and it's not a Catholic or a Protestant church. So it was handed over to this church in 2007. This is just two pictures shared by Dr. Jahangir Surabji on the Armenian cemetery in Antop Hill. Now, I've been informed by Mrs. Joshi that there are 1,812 Armenian graves, I haven't counted them, in the Antopil Cemetery. It's been handed over to the Baha'is to look after because they share a common wall and they look after the cemetery really, really well. So Dr. Surabji is a Baha'i and he's taken these photographs, actually sent me at least 10 photographs, but I've just used 2. Just to sort of for illustrative purposes. Okay. These photographs were shared by me by Mrs. Joshi. This is Mrs. Joshi here as a young lady. And these are when members of Bombay's Armenian community visited Calcutta in 1993. The photograph is dated. And this is the Calcutta's Armenian rugby team. Now, very often, they would come here and they would participate in the rugby tournament at the Bombay Gymkhana with the Bombay police team, and I'd actually met the team many years ago. But I believe they'd no longer come down because the person who used to bring them down from Calcutta had actually passed away. So I'm not aware, but they used to come annually to Bombay. This is a photograph, must be the 1980s or early 90s, of the few Armenian senior citizens who were left over from the community. And I was told that every Sunday after church service, they would meet on the terrace of Ararat building and have coffee and, a little cake or buns or whatever, and so to spend time together. And they would sing Armenian songs, folk music, traditional songs. In fact, Mrs. Joshi's mother used to play the mandolin. So it was a very sort of, even although they were sort of few in number, they sort of kept the spirit alive in our city. So we no longer have that in one sense. This is Mrs. Joshi now today, Zabel Joshi. And when I visited her at her home, she prepared the Armenian black coffee. She says she sources the black coffee from Philip's Coffee House. And she prepared it for me. I took a photograph of her preparing it. And the photograph on the right that you see is actually an Armenian delicacy called kata or kata. She says it's like a bread-like kind of a cake, which is specially made for Easter, and which is sort of, mostly the Armenians prepare that for special occasions. I'd like to stop here, and Naresh, and Naresh can ask the questions after this on Armenian culture.
Into the community, and I think in my journey of making this book, have missed so much of it because there is so little in Calcutta, but I'll take you through that. So, firstly, I just want to quickly thank everybody. I don't want to break the flow, but just really Asiatic Society for this beautiful space, Avid Learning, especially Asad and Aisha, Editions JOJO, Kamna, could I have that book here? That would be so great. And of course, my co-panelists, Sifra and Naresh, thank you so much. So I'm going to take you through something which is different, but also the same community. And it's a very small and an often forgotten history of the Armenians of Calcutta. Now, so this is a book of photos, archive, and text. I'm a photographer. And I really sort of started this book as a photo project, and then, it went on for 10 years and it became something else. But first, I think, just to talk about Calcutta, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Calcutta? I mean, I'm sure many of you all are from there, but for those of you who are not, what is the first thing that, first thoughts? Sorry? Yellow cabs. Okay, very good. Oh, I'm so glad. You all have done very well. I asked this question when I was presenting the book in New York, and everybody fell in the trap and said Mother Teresa. And but, I mean, I think we all agree that Calcutta used to be another place at another time, and I call it like the promised land. It was the land of abundance, and that's why people from all over the world came there to make wealth, actually. These were some of the names: City of Palaces, who would think now, right? But it's so beautiful. City of Joy, Shonar Bangla, all of these things. So I wanted to start with a little excerpt from an article, not written by me, but by a New York Times journalist. And I think it very beautifully locates and describes Calcutta. I'll just read it. Calcutta today is as parochial as it is modern. It lives in the past as much as it lets its past decay. India's first global city is littered with remains of many worlds. The rickshaws that the Chinese brought, an Armenian cemetery, dollops of jazz left by Americans in the war years. It is as much a walker's city as a talker's. It has great eavesdropping potential, that we'll all vouch for, I think, even if you understand only English, and it is perfectly acceptable to start up a conversation with strangers, whether about rain or Shakespeare. Best of all, in Calcutta, you can eat the world. The royal chefs who decamped here from the Mughal court of North India brought the cardamom lace mutton risala stew. British offered a canapé of cheese and pineapple. David Nahum's Jewish forefathers brought the cheese-filled sambusa to Calcutta's new market. This is not a luxury destination. It is more a journey through the grimy layers of time. History is inscribed on every lane, like tattoos on an aging diva. Calcutta was once quite the diva, Shomini Sengupta. And I think I couldn't agree more, and those of us who are from Calcutta, I think some of you all are from here, it is really like an aging diva, and it's heartbreakingly beautiful. So, the first recorded history of Job Chanak, who was from the East India Company, is 1690. He did go there a couple of times before, but those were more like recce trips. 1690 is when he finally settled there. The Armenians there actually were much before, but we don't really know the exact dates. They did go there on the behest of Akbar. Because it was a trading post, they were the world's first merchants, they had to go there and start and recce for trade. And they were actually even considered the stepping stones for the British in Bengal to really sort of start the works of the East India Company. But they left just as quickly as they had arrived. And their footprint is so high, but their numbers were actually very low. So even though you say that, Calcutta at their peak, they were probably 1,200, and that was it actually. So they were not very high in number. So why did I get drawn to this subject? I'm not Armenian. I am a Bengali. But I grew up in Calcutta, and growing up, one would always hear very random sort of mentions, like this building, oh, I think that was made by an Armenian. Oh, I think there's an Armenian church in Tangra. So it was very random. So one always heard. But it actually goes back to a high school party for me personally, and that's how I think my interest was really piqued. So just imagine disco lights and rock music blaring, smoke rings and all of that. And late 90s, all right? So excuse me. But so it was this dark, dingy rooftop. And there was this boy who was standing in a corner, very quiet. He looked very different and sipping Coca-Cola. And he disappeared as quickly as he made an appearance. And I asked a friend, who was that boy? And I forget what name he said, but he said, I remember he said he's Armenian. And so I was in high school then. I think I was in, class 11 maybe. And that was actually the first time I actually encountered an Armenian. I had never, ever met an Armenian before, even though I had lived in Calcutta all my life until then. So this search that I started 12 years ago was really like a slow unraveling of a vast, vast, vast history. I'll take you through some early portraits that I had made of this absent world. And I say absent because they're disappearing every day. There are very few right now in number. I think right now I would imagine there would be about 35, 40 of them. So, and most of these people are now gone. And when I met them, I was so taken in because these were the very people who otherwise I would never meet if I was not interested, if I didn't, pick up the camera and go and start photographing. And they were part of the fabric of the same city, but they were invisible to me until then. This is Uncle Mac and his wife Betty, who's Anglo-Indian. So there was a lot of intermarriage happening as well. Then people leaving, like this young couple now live in the UK. I was very lucky to have been their wedding photographer. And then there was a sense of wonder when I had started photographing back in 2010. And so I was really ticking off the boxes. For me, this was like the new world. It was so juicy, and I had never seen something like this in Calcutta. So I was just photographing, as one of my Armenian friends says, when I went to visit her, she says, you were like somebody with an AK-47 and you were just like photographing constantly. So yeah, so these were some of the spaces and the rituals that I was photographing in the first 3 years that I started photographing. And it's such a different world, right? Like nobody would imagine like this is Calcutta because it's so far removed from the reality of the frenetic city. This is the Armenian Ghat though, and as you can see, it's used for very different purposes right now. So here's the first Christian grave, which is from 1630, and which is Mesrop Jacob Seth, an Armenian historian, wrote in 1936. That he kind of referred to this, and he said that, you know, Job Chanak came in 1630, this is 1690, this is 1630, so could we consider the Armenians the founders of Calcutta? And that's actually the cover of my book. It's just an interesting question, and it actually, it's a great question actually. Not that, I mean, the Calcutta High Court said there are no founders really, but it's a great question to ask, and why not? This is the first church of Calcutta from 1724, which stands in Bara Bazar on Armenian Street. And then these iconic buildings. So if people of here who are from Calcutta will know, or who've been there, if you're familiar, like all of Park Street, for instance, is built by Armenians. This is the rooftop of Queen's Mansion, which was originally Johannes' mansion. Then Stephen Court, Park Mansions, the Oberoi Hotel, which of course is Oberoi now, but it was the Grand Hotel, the Fair Lord. So it's just endless. So I was photographing these. So what was happening to me? So I'm talking partly about history, but I'm also telling you a little bit about the process, because this book is not a history book. It is really my experience of the community, right? And so I realized after 3 years of photographing that I was very deeply unhappy with the work. And I realized, because I mean, they were decent photographs, but to me, they just seem that they don't speak of the community. And they don't do justice to the community at all. I realized that I was exoticizing them because it was such a new world for me. And that I felt was very dangerous for the work. And so I took a step back. I stayed away for about a year. I didn't look at the work. I didn't even meet them actually for about a year. And then I started looking at other materials, other things, objects, etc. Because I felt that I need to look somewhere else. My photos were not really doing the job. And that's when I discovered that there was this gaping absence of material, of people, of course, but of research material, of anything that kind of says Armenian, actually. And it was a big challenge, obviously, but I decided that I was not going to go to a British library or libraries in the US, etc., where there is a lot more material. But I decided to stay with this absence, and I decided to make that my process. And I was like, okay, we'll see, kya hoga, you know, dekhenge. And it was much harder. And so I think one of the reasons the book took so long is also because of this, because I was really just encountering things, and I'll take you through them very quickly after this. So this periphery was obviously then very low, but very, very limited. Because I was actually interested in this question of migration, that when migration actually happens, what gets left behind and who gets left behind. And then it became a work where photography, so even though I'm a photographer, it was very difficult to break away from photography to start with. But then there came a point when photography became a point of departure, and the work became much larger with text and archive and found images and objects. So this, for instance, so I'll just quickly take you through things that I was encountering. This is coal, like Sifra mentioned, they own collieries, and they were just doing so many things. But this is coal. When one looks for coal, I went to the National Museum, and I photographed this there. This is shellac, again, one of the materials that they were trading in, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, shellac was a very, very popular material because it was a dye for textiles. It was also a varnish for paintings. So in Europe, it was very, very popular. And the Armenians pretty much had a monopoly because this plant actually only grows in Bengal and Jharkhand a little bit. This is blue dye. So Armenian Street is also the color dye street. It's called the color dye street. And there are color dye shops hemming both sides, and it's chaotic, and it's just color, color, color everywhere. But when I went to look for indigo, which was also one of the materials it traded in, I didn't find any. So I bought a blue dye, and I photographed that. So this is the way that I was dealing with the absence. This, of course, is a metaphor for pure blood. Purity of blood is a very important thing, as Sifra also mentioned, that there are only roughly 3 million in Armenia, but, you know, as a population, they are very, very small, and they are very together as a community. So purity is very important, and as a metaphor, I photographed red photocolor, actually. So I'll quickly read, because I said it's also like my process of, you know, how I encounter them. I will just read like a small excerpt, and it actually is talking about the first day that I actually went to the Armenian church. The peepal tree was my landmark. After much meandering, I found it. It led into what seemed like plunging into a sea of people, shops, stalls, carts, bicycles, boxes, more people, and so many things. This is the color dye street. Shops untidily hemming both sides, too narrow, too busy for uninterrupted walking. This is also Armenian Street, nothing like what I had imagined. I walked through a formidable wooden door, easily 20 feet tall. At this door, the city mutated, and I stepped into what lay beyond, Armenian Street. And so if you see in this, oh, sorry, it's only in the book. So there's a photograph here, which says Fazle Hussain and Brothers. So it's a color dye shop, and it says dyes, colors, chemicals, Armenian Street. So all the shops there are basically dye shops. And then in the next excerpt, very quickly again, taking on from there, I write, the noise, the chaos, the city dissolved, left behind at the periphery in silent rebellion. The transformation is hardcore and disorienting, evocative of an unknown feeling of deep diving into a time capsule. A pristine steeple, a dazzling white church, a worker sweeping dry mango leaves off tombstones paving the ground. A guard took me into the office. A life-size portrait of Sir Katchik Paul Chater hung on the wall. Mr. Mitra, member of the church committee, part Bengali, part Armenian, assured me permission to photograph. I took a little tour before leaving. I spotted the tomb of Riza Bibe. The church of the Holy Church of Nazareth, Calcutta's oldest church, houses Calcutta's oldest Christian grave. So this is the grave that you just saw from 1630. So now I'll just take you through these objects and old photographs and found images, etc., that I was just finding. So this is Sir Katchik Paul Chater, who, this photograph I made on the, so I'll just tell you the fun of this process, although challenging, but I just found stuff which I don't think I would. So this is a life-size portrait that hangs in the church office, and I kind of took a photo on the slide because this person was creating some problems for me. So this is Sir Katchik Paul Chater, who went to my school, La Martiniere, and then he left for Hong Kong when he was 18. And then he pretty much became the father of modern-day Hong Kong. He built Hong Kong ground up. He's considered today the father of modern-day Hong Kong. This is Arathun Stephens. So we spoke about the Grand Hotel. So he came from Julfa, actually. He, as a lad, and he sold jewelry on a wheelbarrow, and then he made his fortune, and then he built the Grand Hotel, the Stephen Court, the Everest Hotel in Darjeeling, and a lot more. This is J.C. Galston, very, very famous Galston. He was a builder and a punter, as you can see. He owned over 100 horses and built over 300 buildings in Calcutta in his lifetime. This, of course, is the famous Gohar Jan. I'm so thankful, Naresh, for playing that. That was just so incredible. Gohar Jan and singing right here, like wow. So Gohar Jan, this photograph is very interesting because I went to a collector. One day I just found an article in the Times of India, and it mentioned 2 collectors, and I called them, one of them, and he said, sure, you can come. And I went, and this photograph, amongst many, many dusty things, was hanging on a wall, on his wall, just like that, like right up. And he told me that this was given to him by Gohar Jan's only disciple. So I think this is the only photograph like this that exists. But he was very, very possessive of it, rightly so. So I had to, get on a chair, and it was very odd, but that's how I took this photograph. And this is one of the first records, also with him, Rontidev Moitro, this collector, from 1902 that I photographed. This is a classical Armenian question paper from the Calcutta University from 1936. So they were very seriously there, obviously, and this was, education, as Sifra also mentioned, was a very, very important part. But it's interesting to see that Calcutta University also was setting a question paper in classical Armenian. As Naresh had mentioned, matchbox covers, and it's interesting, I don't know if you can see here, but one of them has been painted and designed in Japan, one in Belgium. So they were designed all over, but then they were sold here. This is one of my favorites. This is a register of baptism and it's a really massive old book. And it's the same book which has been in use and continues to be till date from 1904. So that says a lot about the population of Armenians in Calcutta. And this is one of the oldest, or perhaps the oldest surviving rugby photograph from 1936 of the rugby boys. And again, this I took off of the wall of the school. It was just hanging there. So I was sort of doing all of these things, and some things were coming together. And then I met Mari Stephen. She is one of the last pure Armenians, actually. And she is the only one who has preserved her family albums. Otherwise, it was very, very difficult to come by oral history or, family archives. But I have used her archives generously in the book. This is one of the page layouts. So my dilemma then was, when I was just doing all of this, the question was, how do I put all of this together? Because now I had this entire body of work. And apart from that, there was this whole dilemma of misrepresentation, Am I saying too much? Am I saying too little? How will the community accept it? So it was all of these things that were sort of happening. I made and unmade the book. I don't know, I have lost count of how many versions I had. I even had a dummy version, and then that changed, and then finally this book happened, and it happened in 3 sort of parts, but those parts are really for my understanding. But when you go through the book, you'll probably you'll probably get it. But it's architecture, purity of blood, and people, because these are 3 very, very important aspects of the community, as I understand it, of course. So that, and then this is the cover of the book. So that's the book, and it's here actually today. If you all are interested, then you can have a look and you can buy it. And for more information, you can get to my website and you will know more. And that's it from me. Thank you.
The Armenians were a sort of marauding horde of toughies who would descend upon Bombay in the cooler months to sack the city of its treasures. Because my only interaction with the world outside of Bandra was to the sports pages of the Times of India. And as you pointed out, every year the Calcutta old boys would descend at the Bombay Gymkhana and beat the pants out of everybody. Just as a complete tangent, it's among the teams they would play were the Bombay Police. It's said that when rugby began to decline in Bombay, the toffs at the Bombay gym needed somebody to play with. And they figured out that the Bombay Police had a rugby team, had a kabaddi team. And rugby was sort of the same thing. You chased after people and tagged them. So they taught them how to play rugby. But they were no match for the Armenian old boys. But my parents reminded me that there were actually Armenian families who lived around us in Bandra. There was my grandmother's friend, Mrs. Nogier. There were the Sampson family with whom the Fernandes had some association. And there are descendants of Armenians who lived around us. But the first Armenian I remember having a conversation with actually was when I got lost in Paris Corner in Madras. and I blundered into the Armenian church there. There was an old caretaker named Michael. About 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in Madras, I went back because I was looking specifically for the grave of the gentleman who started the first Armenian journal, it's said, in the world. And the first Armenian journal in the world was started in Chennai. So sort of the Armenians have always been around for those of us who sort of had, but we had no awareness that they were actually Armenian. It must have been fairly difficult for you to penetrate what I imagine is a small, perhaps closed community. How did you go about doing your research, Alakananda?
Oh, okay, there's that. Okay, great. Yes, so I think access was a problem, to be honest. Not with the people so much, but because church is really the center of their lives, so I had to go through the church. And what would happen is, so the first time was okay, as I read, and they said okay. But every few years, the priest would keep changing, and then that would actually become a big problem to then convince the next priest that, it's not dodgy and I'm really interested and all of that. But I think the people, when I met them, they were they were very proud, obviously, and that's why I was feeling, I think, this lack in my photographs per se, because what I was hearing from them, I was not being able to feel it in my photographs alone. Mari and Stephen, whose works whose family, she's become a really, really good friend. So many of them are good friends, but most of them, there are not that many people left, actually. But yes, I think with access, I would put it at 50-50, because even when I was showcasing the book, not this version, but the previous version at the Armenian Club, that permission too, because, it's like an authority church thing. But, so that was the problem, kind of, like a bit of a gatekeeping, but the people were very, very lovely.
Sifra, there was Mrs. Joshi, and you must tell us about her Bollywood connection. But there weren't, she was the only Armenian, I think, perhaps, who you could speak to. How did you go about your research?
Actually, I've been trying to sort of reach out to the Armenian community in a manner of speaking for the last few years. And everyone who had sort of done a little research on them, I don't know, I just somehow could not sort of break in or get her number, because she was the go-to person for the Armenian community. She had experienced the community from the 1970s. She knew what the old community was about. So what you have today are Armenians in Bombay, pure Armenians, but from overseas. But they don't know anything about the local history. So it was one of the communities I took really long to reach out to. And it was an old journalist friend of mine from my first job at Eve's Weekly, when I was just a sort of, cub reporter, who on our WhatsApp group, she said, I will get you her number. And she got it, and then things moved really fast. But I tried really hard to get Mrs. Joshi's number. So I even tried to contact her daughter, and I messaged, and but there was no response, But I'm really glad it happened when it did, because it appeared to be the right time, and she gave me the right information and put me through to the younger generation that has come from overseas and is living here now in Mumbai.
Tell us about the Bollywood connection.
Yes. The Bollywood connection. Okay. Now, I didn't mention it in my presentation, but Mrs. Joshi is actually married to a Gujarati businessman from Beirut. She's originally from Beirut, and she settled in Bombay in 1972. She's got 3 daughters, and one of them is the actress Tulip Joshi. And she told me that when her first child, I don't know who the oldest one is, second or third, when her first child was born in 1974, it was the first time a baptism was taking place in the Armenian church after 45 years. So you can imagine how old, all the younger generation had all left. There were no kids being born in the community, and her kids were the youngest in the community at that point in time.
So this is a question I'm going to put to both of you. When you look around Bombay today, what impression is there still of the Armenians? What mark do they leave on our city?
See, I was aware that they were they were well-known traders. I knew that they came here as merchants. I later learned that they were in all walks of life in Mumbai by the early 20th century. They were lawyers, they were doctors, they were in humbler professions, teachers, whatever. What is left of the Armenian legacy is what I've put up on the screen. The church is hidden from eye view, but you see Ararat building very prominently on Meadow Street. You need to notice that, and you need to really walk into the church. Most of the artifacts are no longer there ever since they handed it over to the Malakara Syrian Orthodox Church, but the plaques are there. I never went up to the altar because I believe there are 4 plaques there. And it wasn't respectful really to walk up and really go, although I had my shoes off. And they've got four sort of plaques embedded on the floor of the altar in Armenian, which talks about the foundation stone when the church was founded. And it talks about the renovation also in 1806 or 1812. So there's a lot of information. There are old tombstones embedded in the walls also of the side rooms. So if you actually visit the church, there's a lot to really photograph and really look for. And I believe I was told that even the Syrian Orthodox Church, if you go for service on a Sunday morning or if they allow you into the church, the priests, they wear the Orthodox traditional wear. So it's a sort of a high, sort of a cap, not exactly a cap, a cape, and a cape across. And I believe the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Malankara Church, also has the same costume. They have the same artifacts. Everything is really the same. So it was like the handover by the head of the Armenian Church to the Malankara Church. So it was because they wanted to keep the church functioning the way it was. So that was one of the reasons that it was handed over. There are no more Armenians really speaking in the city who would attend service here. So it's a hidden legacy, and it's something you need to look for.
Alakananda, I was speaking to a colleague in Calcutta today about a discussion, and he's from La Martiniere School, and he says the school song contains a line about the patron who was an Armenian. What are the benefactors, that's what they call him. What are the signs of Stephen's building on Park Street? Is that Armenian?
Stephen House. Yeah.
Stephen House,
Court, yes.
Stephen Court.
Yeah.
What are the other signs of Armenian Calcutta that a visitor could see?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So I think what happened to me is that, so I grew up in Calcutta and I didn't know much at all. But when I talked to my parents, so that generation, there were still Armenians around. So they knew a lot of things. However, I went to La Martiniere. I sang that school song every day for 12 years, and I did not know that Paul Chater was the benefactor who was Armenian, and it's only doing the research of this book. So I think in terms of traces, there is a lot more than in Bombay. So if you all know Free School Street, for instance, Free School Street is a very famous street. It's quite iconic, and the Armenian school is on that street, and it's a free school till date, and so it's called Free School Street. It's interesting because unlike the church here, so when the school was actually facing almost closure because it had come down to only one student, that's when the Echmiadzin got involved, the church, the Holy Church in Yerevan. So the school is actually run by the Church of Yerevan. So their priest comes, and then that's how it functions. So I think if one knows then you can find the traces, and I've been lucky to go to their January 6th Christmas celebrations and all of those things. And every year during January 6th, some newspaper comes out with some article, but the same kind of story is kind of rehashed every year. So it really is, it's there, but it's not really there. It's not very cohesive. So that's how it is.
Sifra, you've also written about the Jewish community in Bombay, the Baghdadi Jews. And Bombay seems so much, the signs of the Sassoons and other Jewish families everywhere, in a way that Calcutta seems to have sort of many more markers of Armenians. What happened? Why did Armenians leave Bombay and go to Calcutta?
It appears, from what I've read and so far, a recent book of 2011 by an author, an historian who came here to Mumbai, and I was lucky really to attend a conference, or it was an international conference by Godrej Archives. And he has written in his book that actually the Armenian, there's a difference. You have the Armenian diaspora, you have the hard trade network of the 17th, 18th century. There's a difference. Not all Armenians were traders. But it was the Julfan merchants, which he's specifically written about, who had this trade network. And somehow or the other, Mumbai was, there were two ways to look at it. It appears that the decline of the population in Mumbai actually took place simultaneous to the breakdown of the new Julfan network in Isfahan. And when that merchant network sort of dispersed. And a lot of Armenians also, there were waves of Armenian migration. And after this network in New Julfa in Isfahan actually broke down, a lot of the Iranian Armenians actually came to Bombay, and from Bombay they migrated elsewhere. So Bombay never had a really big population, but it was a significant population. And at the time when they immigrated from Surat to Bombay, we had some really important Armenian merchants based in the city. But slowly the population just sort of declined, because by 1890, sometime in the late 19th century, there's a little anecdote I came across in one of the monographs, which said that there was an Armenian who came to Bombay, and he wanted accommodation at the church, because they had accommodation for visiting Armenians. And he was told that it was full up, and he couldn't really sort of stay the night there. But the next day, when he met the priest told him, he said, "Oh, I didn't know that you were Armenian." He says, "We're just so few of us, and everything was available, really speaking." So it was that kind of a thing. They were, as Alakananda said, it's a close-knit community, and that's the way they maintain their identity. But Mumbai and Bombay, per se, the decline started really by the late 19th century. There were just old people really left in the city.
So Alakananda, going back to those Armenian old boys who came and played rugby, this sort of seems a bit of a paradox, isn't that? Even as Calcutta's settled Armenian community seems to be in decline, every year, because of the college, you have many young Armenians who come, staying for about 10 years, and then going back. You have a sort of constant flow of people. How does that interaction work between the visiting Armenians and the settled community?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. But I first say something about rugby. It's an anecdote. It's very funny. And I was photographing one of these young boys, and he used to be part of the national rugby team. And he said that, they had gone somewhere out of India to play for India. And he said at some point we realized that out of a team of however many they are, I think 11 or 12, he said 9 of us were Armenians. But we were all talking in Hindi, and we were like, why are we talking in Hindi? But what happens is that I think the interaction is there, in the sense that I used to spend some time with Sonia John. She was a very well-known member of the community, and I went to visit her. So these kids that come, and they come, obviously, and they go home because it's a free school. They get to go home every 3 years. so they're not there, they don't go home every year. So these sort of older Armenians living in Calcutta become like their family in a way. So the time that I used to spend with Sonia John, I realized that these kids were just going and doing her chores and helping her out and really like taking advice from her. And in fact, Sonia John had done a DNA test of her Armenian heritage. And when I went looking for it, I actually had to ask these kids because she had passed away by then. I think that network has happened quite well.
So I think we should interject. So this is a school, and it draws students from Iran and from Russia and from other places.
Yes, so even till today, the kids come from Iran, Armenia, Iraq, and I think at some point, when I was photographing, there was only one kid from Calcutta, but everybody else was from outside. All Armenians, they have to be Armenians. Yeah, I mean, they can be of mixed blood, but Armenians.
Let's open it up for questions. Put your hand up, somebody will bring a mic to you.
For keeping the spirit of Bombay alive since ages, and to the panelists. So it's very intriguing to know that there is so much Armenia around one of the most oldest and yet youngest metropolises of India, and yet they remain invisible to the common man. So what do you think? What is the reason behind the invisibility, apart from the population? And in fact, when we speak about population, we know about the Iranians, the Parsis, we know about the Jews, and we know about the Jews and the Iranians, but then why not? Why so much of mystery around the Armenian legacy?
Mystery per se, it's just that the community hasn't been around for so many years, and especially as you're quite young, I'm guessing that you would not be aware of them at all. Yeah, so I mean, my generation, Alakananda's generation, Naresh's generation would be aware of the Armenian community, and at some point we would have either heard of them or interacted with them, because the Armenian I knew of and who I did know sort of fleetingly was Mrs. Mehta, Nuak Mehta, who was very, very active in the Bombay Local History Society, and she was a great supporter, and she was the Armenian that I knew for many, many years. And I mean, we attended all the Bombay history talks together and things like that. But yes, your generation would not be aware of it, and it's not a mystery because a lot has been written about the Armenians in Bombay, written by the community. Meshrov Set, for example, he's written a wonderful book on his community. He was a teacher in the Armenian college and a historian also. And you have a lot of new monographs and books written on the Armenian community in India, and Bombay is also part of it. So it's all there. You just have to sort of know where to look. That's it.
Thank you, Avid, and thank you, all of you, for a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you both, did you all, when you were talking to the people in the diaspora, your Mrs. Joshi and whoever it is you met, did anybody mention the Armenian genocide issue, or was that something that was just never touched upon?
To be on the diaspora and the trade network. And yes, you're right, the Armenian genocide was mentioned by all my sources. So it's just that I did not mention it in this presentation, but yes, it's very much there.
So shall I say, as much a part of their discourse in a normal thing?
It's very much a part of their discourse because the Armenian people have actually faced a lot of political, not only has the country faced political turmoil, but the Armenian people themselves have faced persecutions at different points in their histories. And one of the recent high points is the genocide that took place in 1914 to 1950. 1914, no, it started actually earlier. Yeah, 14 to 1918. So it's not something that's, they mention, all of them mention it. Yeah.
also from educated originally in Calcutta, the Sakis brothers, who then went on to set up these iconic hotels, the Raffles in Singapore,
Yes.
the Eastern and Oriental in Penang, the Crag Hotel in Penang, possibly the Goodwood Park in Singapore, and of course the Strand in Rangoon, all of which are beautiful establishments which I would recommend to anyone in this room, all done by the Sakis brothers, originally educated at the Armenian College in Cal.
So I just want to add about the genocide issue. So in Calcutta, at the church, there is actually a genocide memorial. And every year on 24th April, there is a memorial service. So yes, as Sifra said, it's very much part of the discourse. In fact, there's a photograph of the memorial in my book as well. It's something that, but although it's interesting because the Calcutta Armenians, and I'm guessing most of the Bombay Armenians as well, were not, they didn't come here as a direct result of the genocide, but obviously it's a very, very big part of their history.
I just wanted to know, why is it that the Armenians celebrate Christmas on the 6th of January?
I looked it up, and basically the Armenians, as I mentioned, were the first nation to adopt Christianity as its state religion. And this was in 301 CE. So they follow what is known as the old calendar or the Julian calendar. And the Catholics, they follow what is called the Gregorian calendar. So 1582, I think. So that's where the difference in the dates come in the celebration of Christmas. But I was also told, interestingly, that the Armenians also observe 25th of December in some way as a feast. So, but Christmas Day itself is celebrated on 6th of January. Right.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we should wrap up here. I'd like to end on a note of sort of cautious optimism. If you look closely at the photographs, Jahangir's photographs of the Baha'i, of the Armenian graves in Antop Hill, you would see that the crosses have etchings of vines and leaves and grapes. In Armenian tradition, that's a symbol of regeneration. A couple of years ago, the BBC's Andrew Whitehead reported that the number of Armenians living in India had increased just a little. That's because thousands of Indian students are now studying medicine in Armenia, and they come back, a few of them, with Armenian spouses. He quoted one person as saying that perhaps about 60 Armenians have moved to India over the last few years. It would probably be too much of a leap to suggest that the Armenian community in India is on the verge of a revival, but perhaps there will be enough Armenians around at least to keep the institutions set up their forebears in tidy shape over the next few decades. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. Buy the books and get them signed.
Thank you. Thank you, Naresh, Sifra, Alakananda. What a fantastic presentation, how well it's segued into each other. You know, what's interesting to see the series Uncovering Urban Legacies. We've covered 4 other diasporas, and they're so disparately different than the Armenians. It's quite intriguing, and we have them all archived on our YouTube channel in case you want to go see them. When you just watch them, they're worth watching. Thank you to our partners, Mumbai Research Centre, Asiatic Society, Editions JOJO, and obviously the Gateway House for helping us put this thing together. Thank you to you all for braving the weather and coming here. At Avid, you know we don't stop. Our next program is tomorrow. In fact, we have Sri Shakti, which is Anuradha Pal on tabla at the Royal Opera House in celebration of International Day of the Girl Child. So in case you guys are doing nothing tomorrow evening at 6:30, just pop by. Sagar can organize some passes for you all. And we're doing a session on NFTs. That's the new thing we've been focusing on, the brave new world of NFTs, and that's going to be at IFPI, which is the Ice Factory Ballad Estate, next Friday on the 14th of October. To find out more, just stalk us on social media or check out our website, and thank you very much for coming, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you guys once again.